In this video, we're going to talk about utilizing arrays, starting with finding out the length of an array. The length of an array is associated with the length property of the array here. This property holds the number of elements the array can hold, which is set when the array is created and cannot be changed thereafter. Unlike methods, the length property or attribute is accessed directly without parentheses. For example, if myList is the reference variable pointing to a valid array in Java, you can use that reference dot the length property or fields or attributes to give you a size. So the example here returns 10. This is a very important property because it allows us to iterate through every single one of these elements, knowing that we have length number of elements inside of it. We can compute, for example, the sum of all of the elements or the average of all of the elements in that array. Let's look at a coding example. This is a sample console application. Let's create an integer array. Let's say this integer array is ARR, and let's instantiate an element of 1000 integers here. The very first thing we do is we do arr.length. Let's see if this returns 1000. Execute. So array.length gives you the size of the array. Knowing the length of the array, you can make use of the length information to create, for example, a loop that iterates every single one of these elements inside the array, I++. The reason why you would do I less than arr.length is because, remember, array indexing starts with 0, and the very last element is length minus 1. Alternatively, you can say arr.length minus 1, and you would do less than equal to. So these two versions of loops achieve the same. And you can compute the summation of all of the elements or the average of it by filling the logic here. Let's go back to our lecture. It turns out in Java, as we alluded to earlier, when an array is declared and created, your software sets aside memory spaces to store each and every single one of these elements in memory according to the type of the element. In addition, there are default values assigned to these elements. If your array is an integer, then every single one of these elements would have a default value of 0. If this had been a char, every single one of these elements would have a default 0, indicated by this backslash u0000. And if this had been a Boolean array, then all of these elements will have a false value. If this had been a double, it would be 0.0, so on and so forth. However, if this had been a wrapper class Boolean with capital B, as you know, this is a class, then its default value for these elements inside this capital B Boolean array would have a value of null, because these elements would have been what we call objects. We'll talk about class in a separate video. Let's look at indexed variables next. We talked about this, that array indexing starts with 0 and ends with length minus 1. In the prior examples or in the separate figures from your textbook, myList holds 10 double values with indices ranging from 0 to 9 for a total of 10. You can access each element through use of array reference name bracket notation plus the index value. For example, if you want to add the beginning element and the very last element of the array, you will simply write, assuming ARR is the name of the array, index 0 plus ARR index 9. That's how you would add them and access them using this index notation. It's very important. In a for loop or in any sort of loop, you can make use of the counter variable I or J or K to access an element at ARR index I. Let's look at an example next. This is an example of, let's say you have myList. What we're trying to do is we'll take the very first element and its next immediate element at index 0 and 1 respectively and add them all up and store the summation of the very first and second elements into the third element with index 2. Let's assume that this myList is an integer array. Let's also further assume that the very first element has a value of 10, the second element has a value of 20, 10 plus 20 will give you 30, which means the third element would have a value of 30 at the end of your assignment after this statement is evaluated. In summary, understanding how to utilize your array, making use of its length property and also index values, is fundamental in any programming language. They enable you to manipulate arrays effectively and safely.